All right, everybody, we are back for section 7 of our new research methods course, and today we are going to be talking all about surveys. And I know basically everybody watching this has taken some kind of survey before. I mean, even like a multiple choice exam that you took in school could really be thought of just as a weird specialized kind of survey, right? Now, why are surveys so popular? Because we use surveys for, I get at least a dozen of them a week from various sources. Well, for one thing, they're versatile. You can study a lot of different subjects in a lot of different ways and answer a lot of different research questions just with some kind of survey. Asking people how they feel about something or what they know about something, etc., etc. They're also very efficient. If you can get a good sample, then the cost to do surveys is usually very low, especially if you can get a good internet sample or pen and paper sample. You get a lot of return for not very little or not very much money and time and energy, etc. They're also very generalizable because you can get a good wide smattering of population. If you can get a good enough sample and a large enough sample size, they're easily generalizable to really large populations. That's one of the reasons we do them so often, say, in politics. We want to know who's going to win the next election. We use a survey to try to figure out who different states are going to vote for. And they do a very good job at generalizing from our relatively small sample up to the state or the country or whatever unit you are trying to make conclusions about, right? Now, one of the things we have to do with a survey is make sure and do a pretest, right? Because nobody's perfect. So if I were to sit down and write a survey about any given subject, I would obviously make mistakes. I'd have typos, I'd write questions that weren't quite clear, etc. So what I want to do is take my survey and give it to some smaller sample of people and let them take it, not because I'm interested in what they have to say, but I'm interested in how they the process and the experience they have taking the survey. So if they're unclear on something, if they start returning data that doesn't make any sense, if they have questions about how something is supposed to work or not work or whatever, I can get out of the way in that pretest, fix up my survey, make it more understandable, make it so that it will return better data, and then I can delete all that information from the pretest and actually send it out to my real sample that I actually want to gather data from, right? One of the things I have to worry about is question order, because it is amazing how impactful even something as simple as question order can be on how people answer questions, right? So, let's go with a political poll, right? If I ask somebody first, like, has your income risen or fallen in the last 4 years? And then I ask, who are you going to vote for? That first question, has your income risen or fallen? If it's risen, they will be much more likely to vote for the incumbent in that second question. If it's fallen, they'll be much more likely to vote for the non-incumbent in the second question than if I had asked them in the other order. If I ask them first who you're going to vote for and then has your income risen or fallen, I will get very different answers on the who you're going to vote for question than I would if I asked the income question first, just because when people have it in their heads like, oh, my income has risen, things are good, I'm going to be more likely to vote for the incumbent. So question 1 can influence how people answer question 2. Question 5 can influence how people answer question 6. This is part of the method that many unscrupulous non-scientific groups will use to create what are called push polls. Push polls are specifically designed to get a certain answer, right? So if I was working for a political campaign and I really wanted a poll that looked good for my candidate, I might start asking questions like, hey, have you heard about the scandal from this other candidate? Have you heard about the fact that, the economy has been doing really great or really terrible? And then I'll ask, do you want to vote for my candidate or not? Specifically trying to get people to support my candidate in this survey so I can release it to the news and be like, hey, look, 85% of the people support my candidate. When in reality, it was question order and question wording, and the subjects I'm asking about and the order I'm asking about them in is specifically designed to get that answer that makes my candidate look good, rather than an actual accurate answer to a poll. So push polls are never scientifically valid, but they're used all the time for things like politics, for things like advertising, where they're not really interested in the outcome. They're trying to predetermine the outcome before the survey is even sent out. Now, one of the things we have the choice to do in a survey, there are lots of different ways we can make our survey kind of more powerful or easier to take or better. One of the things we can do are what are called skip patterns, right? So if we were giving a survey to people about their criminality, we might have a question that says, have you ever smoked marijuana? And then if they answer yes, we might want to ask some follow-up questions, right? We might want to ask them, when was the last time you smoked marijuana? How often do you smoke marijuana? How much do you purchase your marijuana for, etc.? But if they answer no to that first question, I've never smoked marijuana, then why would they bother to spend the time answering questions about how often or when was the last time or how much they bought it for? Those questions clearly don't apply to them, right? So if we have a skip pattern, and it's difficult to do this on a pen and paper survey, but if we have some kind of electronic survey or computer assisted survey, we can make it much easier and just say, if they answer no to that have you ever smoked marijuana question, then skip those further follow-ups and go right to the have you ever done this other thing question, which might be technically 5, 6, 7 questions later, but the person taking the survey never even notices, right? So in a survey of, say, 100 questions, a survey taker may only take 50 or 60, depending on how many are skipped because of their answers on those earlier questions, right? Another thing that you very commonly see are Likert scales. And Likert scales are just the usually 5 answer choices, and it's either strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree, or strongly approve, approve, neutral, disapprove, strongly disapprove, right? Where they have those kind of 5 answer choices, and there's kind of a sliding scale of how much you agree with something, or how much you approve of something, or how much you like something, or whatever. Those are called Likert scales. And again, the most common one is the 5-point Likert scale, but you can also have 7-point Likert scales or 4-point Likert scales, really depending on kind of the nature of what the particular question you're asking is and how many options you want to give to the survey taker, etc., etc. We can also do what's called an omnibus survey. And this is like a much larger, much more kind of wide-ranging survey. Now, these can be difficult because they're almost invariably take a much longer time for the survey taker, which means you're going to have a lower response rate. But they also have a lot of benefits, right? So let's say I want to do a survey for some criminal justice research question, and I know 3 of my colleagues also want to do surveys for criminal justice-based research question, and none of us can really afford a good large survey with the sample size that we would really need to answer our questions. Well, why don't we take all 4 of our surveys and combine them together into one? Because I guarantee you, if all 4 of us are asking about criminal justice related issues, we're going to have a lot of the same questions, right? We're going to have, obviously we're going to ask the standard age, gender, race, have you committed this crime before? Have you committed that crime before? Do you have delinquent peers and acquaintances? We're all going to be interested in those same questions. So even if each one of us each one of the four of us has a 100 question survey we want to ask. If we combine them all together, it's not going to be 400 questions. It might be 250 questions, right? Yet we're all still getting the information we wanted to ask. So if we combine all our surveys like that into one big survey, we'll have 4 times the budget for a survey that's not 4 times the size, and we can get a much larger sample and much more information for all of our research questions than we would if we tried to do it as 4 individual surveys. So that's a big omnibus survey. And then if we obviously include things like skip patterns, we can make it even shorter. We could also do what's called a split ballot design. And this is where there's some questions that we're really interested in and we need a really large sample size and we really want to get a lot of good data on these questions. And then some other questions that, we don't really care about that much, right? So let's say we have, 50 questions that we really care about and then 100 questions that we don't need quite as large a sample size on. What we can do is kind of randomize which survey takers answer which questions, right? So everybody gets the 50 we're really interested in, and then you get a random set of 25 of the other ones that we're not so interested in. So everybody takes only a 75 question survey. We get tons of data about the 50 questions that are really important, and we get a little bit of information about those other questions that we don't really need such large sample sizes on. We're just adding those as kind of side notes. The sample size doesn't matter as much, etc. And with that split ballot design, we can keep surveys short while still getting plenty of data for our research question and hopefully be able to answer our research question in a satisfactory way, but also get higher response rates just because, we don't want to have to do analysis on the 200 people that answered out of the 20,000 we sent the survey to. Now, speaking of response rates, there are lots of different kinds of surveys we can do, right? I talked about this a tiny bit just at the beginning of this section. One of the more kind of traditional ones is the mailed survey, right? We have physical pieces of paper with surveys on them, put them in envelopes, put a stamp on them, mail them out to some list of residential addresses we have, or that we were able to obtain maybe from the post office. People receive these in their mailbox. Hopefully for us, they fill them out, put them back in an envelope, and mail them back to us, and we might get answers, weeks later. These are both expensive and inexpensive depending on what you're comparing them to, right? Compared to, say, an in-person survey where we have to hire people to stand outside, malls and grocery stores and on street corners and ask people, hey, would you like to take a survey? And then they have to stand there and read the questions. Mailed surveys are much cheaper, but with modern technology and the ability to use computers and email, etc., mailed surveys are much more expensive because even though each one essentially only costs whatever the paper and envelope costs plus the however many cents for a stamp, that's still a heck of a lot more than emails, right? So mailed surveys are kind of in the middle when it comes to costs these days, but traditionally, prior to the invention of the internet, they were very cheap. So there were a lot of those done. In-person surveys, again, much more expensive, but you get a much higher response rate. You get a much more kind of large number of responses in a relatively short amount of time, but they cost a lot of money, right? Group surveys, these are very commonly used in marketing. Focus groups especially, the way television was chosen up until relatively recently, and maybe some parts of TV still do it this way, they would go to, say, a mall or a large gathering place in somewhere in middle America, pull out 8 to 10 people, ask them if they want to be paid some amount of money for an hour's worth of their time, and then those 8 to 10 people would sit in a room and watch a 30-minute episode of this new TV show that the TV channel was thinking about maybe airing on TV. And they would ask those 8 to 10 people, hey, did you like it? Did you like this character? Were you excited by it? Would you say it was funny? Would you say it was dramatic? Would you, And those 8 to 10 people would essentially get to decide what television shows made it onto TV and what didn't. So those group surveys where people can kind of sit down as a group, learn about something, whether it's a TV show or a political candidate's message or whatever, and then one interviewer can kind of interview and survey all 8 to 10 or 15 or however many people at once. Those have a long history in especially marketing. Phone surveys. This is how a lot of political polling is done even to this day, although it's getting slightly less common. Because for most of the 20th century, especially the second half of the 20th century, the best sampling frame that could be had for any given city, and conglomerately even states and such, was the phone book. Almost everybody, almost every resident of any given city was listed in the phone book. And thus, if you wanted to take a good sample, you just get the phone book and draw a sample of however many phone numbers you wanted, and boom, there's your good random representative sample of all the people in that area. The problem is, with the invention of cell phones, the phone book is becoming a much worse sampling frame for a good representative group of people in any given city. But they still use phone sampling. They might use random digit dialing. They might use some other method of figuring out what phone numbers to call. But you'll still get calls every once in a while saying, hey, I'm so-and-so with such and such group, and I'm taking a survey about who are you going to vote for, or what grocery store you prefer to shop at, or how you feel about, this new product or whatever. So phone surveys are still very, very common. Internet surveys. The internet has made surveys so much easier because they're essentially free. If you can get a good sample of people, you can do an internet survey for essentially $0, right? You can get huge response rates. Unfortunately, though, if you just open up a survey to anybody on the internet who wants to take it, you're guaranteed to get terrible information. Because the nature of how the internet works, people just want to screw with surveys on the internet, right? So many years ago, I think it was Taylor Swift did an online internet survey open to anybody asking what country should Taylor Swift go to perform a concert at next. And as answer choices, luckily they didn't leave the answers to where people could input some new answer. They had a fixed set of answers, but it was every country on the planet. And people had the choice of picking whatever country they thought Taylor Swift should go to perform next. And guess which country won? It wasn't Germany, it wasn't France, it wasn't Japan, it wasn't China. It was North Korea, which is absolutely the last country that Taylor Swift would want to fly to in order to do a concert. So, because people want to screw with surveys when they're on the internet. And if you want to know more about that, please take my cybercrime course. But internet surveys just open to anybody are a terrible idea. But what you can do is somehow limit the number of people or the type of person that gets to take it, often with emailed invitations, right? So I don't necessarily want anybody to take it, but I'm going to send out a giant email to 10,000 people asking those 10,000 people to take my survey, and only if you get one of those emails can you take it. That is a much better, much more accurate response, and you'll get a much more representative sample than you will if you just put a survey up on the internet and then let anybody kind of go in and take it. Now, these days, a lot of surveys are done as a mixed mode survey. And this is where you kind of combine two or more of the above, right? So you might mail people a postcard with a internet URL on it telling them where they can go to take a survey. So it's kind of a mixed mailed and internet survey. Or I believe the NCVS, the National Crime Victimization Survey, if you become a part of their sample, you get interviewed, I think it's 5 times, the first 2 of which are in person, and then the 3rd, 4th, and 5th are over the phone, right? So if you combine these different modes, you can kind of balance the positives and negatives of each one to the point where it becomes the most efficient for you and the kind of data you're after and the kind of budget you have and the kind of personnel and time and energy and all those things. You can really balance the different methods of gathering data so you can get kind of your optimum result, right? But each one of these different types has a very different response rate. So a mailed survey, and honestly, I'm thinking this is kind of high. I'm betting this, this is from a relatively reputable source, this graph I have here on this slide. But a 50% mailed survey, that means if I want 1,000 responses, I would have to mail out 2,000 surveys, right? Which is better than an email survey. If I want 1,000 responses for an email survey, I'm going to have to send out 3,000 some odd emails, right? So just because something is cheaper doesn't necessarily mean we're going to have that much of a cheaper time doing it, right? So in-person surveys are a lot more expensive, but because the response rate is so much higher, it's not as more expensive than one mailed survey versus one in-person survey might kind of seem at first glance. Because with in-person surveys, I'm only going to have to attempt to survey 1,500 people, whereas with mailed surveys, if I want the same response rate, I might have to mail out 3 or 4 times as many. And that's not enough to make the mailed survey more expensive than the in-person survey, but it does close the gap some, right? So what you really need to do when choosing what type of survey determine what kind of survey you want, figure out what your response rate is likely to be, figure out how large of a sample you need to answer your research question, and then do the math to figure out, well, if I need X number of people and the response rate is this, I'm going to have to mail out, I'm going to have to attempt to contact this many times more people than I actually want responses from, right? And that can be a relatively tricky kind of mathematical balance to really get right, depending on kind of the subject of your survey can also affect these response rates. All kinds of things can affect these. And if you need 1,000 responses, do you have to mail out 2,000 surveys or 5,000 surveys or 10,000 surveys? That's going to depend on time of year and what the subject of your survey is and how good you can make the envelope, how interesting you can make it seem from the outside and all those things. So that can be a very difficult process in surveys. But we're going to go ahead and take a break. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be right back.